The whole kingdom whispered that the Alpha King's new bride would weep from terror, and on their wedding night, as the heavy oak doors locked behind them, she finally broke down in tears. Her towering husband sat in the shadows, certain she was terrified of the cold, guarded monster he had become, but he was entirely wrong. She wasn't crying out of fear, she was crying because the firelight had just caught the jagged scar on his arm. The ruthless Alpha King was the fragile, drowning boy she had saved 11 years ago, and he had absolutely no idea who she was. The wedding feast tasted like ash in Claire's mouth. She sat at the high table in the great hall of Thornwood Castle, her hands folded neatly in her lap, and watched the candles gutter in the draught that slipped through the ancient stone walls. The hall was vast and cold, hung with faded banners that bore the thorn and oak sigil of House Thornwood. There were perhaps 40 guests, not the hundreds her mother had once described at her own wedding, and most of them were men. Knights, stewards, the gray-bearded counselors of the Alpha King. They ate and drank and talked in low voices, and no one looked at her for very long. Claire Millbrook of the Southern Valleys, now Claire of House Thornwood, pressed her fingertips against her palm and counted the calluses there. Her left hand, the one she used for needlework, had thin ridges of hardened skin from years of embroidery and mending. She had brought her own linen and thread to the castle, a small chest of them, because her stepmother had said a lady should always be able to make herself useful. Useful. Claire turned the word over in her mind and found it both heavy and light at the same time. Across the table, the Alpha King was listening to one of his knights, with his chin resting on his fist. Edward of House Thornwood, her husband now, though the word felt borrowed like a cloak that did not quite fit her shoulders. He was taller than she remembered from the betrothal, though perhaps that was because she had only seen him once, and briefly, at her father's manor in the autumn rain. Now, by candlelight, she could see the deep brown of his hair, the way it curled slightly at the collar of his tunic, and the amber of his eyes when he turned for just a moment to glance at her. Claire looked down at her plate. She had eaten it. If we all meant Souther, think, almost nothing. You should try the honeyed pear, said a voice at her elbow. Her lady's maid Marin had stepped close to refill her goblet, and under the pretense of pouring wine she leaned in. Old Nan made it herself, and she'll be cross if it comes back untouched. Claire managed a small smile. Marin was the only face in this hall that felt familiar, a plump, round-cheeked woman from the Millbrook household who had been assigned to her as a wedding gift. She was already knitting something long and gray in the corner during the ceremony, which had made Claire want to laugh, though she had not. "I'm not hungry," Claire said quietly. Marin's eyes, sharp and kind at once, studied her for a moment. Then she straightened and moved on, and Claire was alone again in the noise of the hall. The feast dragged, course after course, toast after toast. The men of Thornwood drank heavily and spoke of the winter stores, of the border disputes with the eastern fells, of a wolf that had been taking sheep from the northern pastures. Claire listened without being asked to speak. No one addressed her directly except to raise a glass in her general direction. She was the king's bride, the daughter of a minor house, brought north to seal an alliance that her father had called a good match and her stepmother had called a necessity. She had learned long ago not to argue with either of them. It was near midnight when the feast finally ended. The guests filed out with lanterns and good-natured jokes that faded as they crossed the courtyard into the cold night air. Claire stood at the high table with her hands clasped in front of her, unsure of where she was meant to go. A servant appeared and bowed, gesturing toward a stairwell at the far end of the hall. "The king's chambers, my lady," he said. "If you will follow me." Claire followed. The stone stairs were narrow and worn smooth in the center by centuries of feet. Torches guttered in iron sconces, casting long shadows that slid across the walls. At the top of the stairs, the servant stopped before a heavy oak door and knocked once. When there was no answer, he pushed it open and stepped aside. "The king will be along shortly," the servant said. "He asked that you make yourself comfortable." And then he was gone, and Claire was standing alone in the doorway of a room she had never seen, which was now, by law and by ceremony, hers. The bedchamber was large but spare. A great bed with carved posts dominated the center, its coverlet a deep forest green. A fire crackled in the hearth, and a single chair sat beside it, draped with a worn woolen blanket. On a small table near the window Someone had placed a tray of bread and cheese and a jug of watered wine. Claire walked to the window and looked out at the dark shapes of the courtyard below, the torches moving like fireflies as the last guests dispersed. She stood there for a long time, her forehead pressed against the cold glass, and tried to remember why her father had called this a good match. The door opened behind her. She did not turn. Edward's footsteps crossed the room, slow, deliberate, the tread of a man who had spent his life in armor and knew how to fill a space without announcing himself. He stopped a few paces behind her. She could smell the smoke of the hall on his clothes, the faint tang of ale. "You may take the bed," he said. His voice was low, like she remembered, but softer now without the formality of the ceremony. "I'll sleep in the chair." Claire turned, startled. He was standing in the middle of the room with his cloak over his things, his face half in shadow. She did not know what she had expected. Distance, perhaps. Coldness. Not this quiet offer, this handing over of the only comfortable place in the room. "I couldn't," she began. "You can," he said simply. "I've slept in worse places than a chair. The border campaigns were not known for their feather beds." He did not look at her as he said it. He was already moving toward the hearth, laying his cloak over the back of the chair, settling himself into it with the ease of a man who had made peace with discomfort. The firelight caught the side of his face, and Claire saw, for the first time, the tiredness there. The lines around his eyes were deeper than she had noticed at the feast. He looked, she thought, like a man who had not slept well in a very long time. She should say something. She knew she should say something. But the words felt too large for her throat, and so she simply stood there, watching him, until the silence grew heavy between them. "Are you afraid of me?" he asked quietly, still not looking at her. The question caught her off guard. She opened her mouth to say no, because that was the polite thing, the expected thing. But what came out instead was something closer to the truth. "I don't know you," she said. "Is that the same thing?" He was quiet for a moment, then he made a sound that might have been a laugh, though it was too soft and too tired to be one. "No," he said. "I don't think it is." He reached for the jug of wine on the table, poured himself a cup, and drank it in one long swallow. As he set the cup down, the sleeve of his tunic rode up, and Claire saw the scar. It was old, that scar. A pale rope of raised skin running from his right elbow down almost to his wrist. It caught the firelight like a line of silver thread, and Claire found herself staring at it, her breath catching in her throat. She knew that scar. She had seen it once, years ago, on a summer afternoon by the river in the southern valleys. "Have you been to the Millbrook lands before?" she heard herself ask. Edward's hand stilled. He looked at her then, properly, for the first time since she had entered the room. His amber eyes were unreadable in the firelight. "Once," he said, "a long time ago, when I was a boy." "By the river," Claire said. "The one with the flat stones, where the children used to jump across to the far bank." He was very still now. The fire crackled between them. "Yes," he said slowly. "That river." Claire's heart was beating hard against her ribs. She wanted to ask more, to push, to demand, but the words would not come, and something in his face told her that she should not. Not now, not tonight. She took a breath and let it out slowly. "I think I would like to sleep now," she said, "if you don't mind." He nodded once and turned back to the fire. "Good night, Claire." "Good night," she said. She walked to the great bed and sat down on its edge, still in her wedding dress, because she did not know where her nightclothes were and did not have the courage to ask. She lay back against the pillows, her arms at her sides, and stared at the canopy above her. The firelight flickered against the carved wood, casting shapes that shifted and danced. She did not mean to cry. Truly, she did not. She had not cried at the feast, or in the stairwell, or even when the servant had left her alone in this vast and unfamiliar room. But now, lying in the bed that smelled of lavender and dust, in a castle that was not her home, married to a man she did not know, the tears came without warning. They slid down Tim temples and into her hair, silent and hot, and she could not seem to stop them. She cried for her mother, who had died when she was 7 and had never seen her daughter married. She cried for the river in the southern valleys, and for the boy she had once pulled from the water, thin and shivering, with a deep gash on his arm that she had bound with her own torn hem. She cried for the scar on that boy's arm, now a man's arm, now her husband's arm, and for the fact that he had not recognized her, and she cried because she was here, in this cold northern castle, with a man who had been gentle to her in the only way he knew how, and she did not know if that would ever be enough. The fire popped, the shadows shifted, and somewhere behind her, in the chair by the hearth, she heard a small sound, a breath drawn in sharply. held, then released. She did not turn. She did not want him to see her crying, but she knew he had heard her, and she knew, somehow, that he was still awake, sitting in that chair with his scarred arm resting on his knee, listening to her cry and not coming any closer. She fell asleep to the sound of the fire and the knowledge that she was not alone. In the morning, when she woke, the chair by the hearth was empty, and a woolen blanket, still warm, had been laid gently over her shoulders. The morning light came gray and thin through the narrow window, the color of old pewter. Claire lay still for a long moment, the woolen blanket still warm against her shoulders, and listened to the unfamiliar sounds of a castle waking up, the distant clatter of pots, the low murmur of voices in the yard below, the cry of a hawk somewhere over the fields. She had not slept well. That was not a surprise. She had lain awake for hours after the fire had burned low, thinking about the man in the chair, about the scar on his arm, about the way he had not come closer even when she cried. There was a kindness in that restraint, she thought, but Sheeta did not know what to do with it. The door opened a crack, and Marin slipped in, carrying a tray. Claire's maid was a round, rosy-cheeked woman with a talent for finding out things no one had told her yet. She set the tray on the table by the window and drew the curtains back a little, letting in more of the pale light. "You're awake, then," Marin said, her voice carefully cheerful. "The king's orders were to let you sleep as long as you needed. He said you'd had a long journey." Claire sat up slowly, holding the blanket to her chest. "He said that?" "He did, in so many words." Marin poured a cup of warm milk and set it on the bedside table. "He also told the kitchen to send up a proper breakfast, not just bread and water. That's more than some brides get, I can tell you that." Claire wrapped her fingers around the cup, letting the warmth seep into her palms. She did not know what to make of Edward's thoughtfulness. It sat in her chest like a small, cautious bird, uncertain whether to trust the branch beneath it. Did he say anything else?" she asked. Marin hesitated, then shook her head. "No, my lady, he was already in the yard when I came up, saddling his horse. Old Nan said he rides out most mornings before the sun's fully up. It's been his way since he was a boy." Claire nodded and drank her milk. The silence in the room felt large. She thought about the scar on his arm, about the cold river water, and the boy who had not told her his name. She thought about how different he looked now, tall and grave and carrying the weight of a kingdom on his shoulders. She thought about whether she should tell him. Marin was watching her with a knowing look. "You're thinking about something, my lady. You've got that wrinkle between your brows." Claire touched her forehead self-consciously and managed a small smile. "It's nothing. Just, this place is very different from home." "That it is," Marin agreed. "But the food's better, and the walls are warmer. Give it time." The breakfast arrived as promised, bread still warm from the oven, a small pot of honey, some soft cheese, and a handful of late apples. Claire ate slowly, listening to the sounds of the castle settle into its morning rhythm. She had never been in a place this large with this many people moving through it, each with their own purpose. After breakfast, Marin helped her dress in a simple gown of deep green wool, practical and warm, and pinned her hair back with a silver clasp. Claire looked at herself in the small, polished mirror and saw a stranger looking back, a woman who was now the wife of a king, in a castle far from the river and the hills where she had grown up. She wondered if Edward felt the same way looking at his own reflection. She wondered if he ever thought about the boy he had been, or the girl who had pulled him from the water. She decided for now to keep her silence. It was too soon. He had not recognized her, and to tell him now might seem like a claim, like she was trying to use an old kindness to buy his favor. She would wait. She would watch. She would learn who this man was before she decided what to do with the secret she carried. The morning passed in a blur of introductions. Old Nan, the kitchen mistress, was a wiry woman with sharp eyes and flour on her apron, who looked Claire up and down and pronounced her too thin by half. Sir Aldrich, the king's knight, had been polite, thanked with distant, his hand never far from his sword hilt, his eyes following her with a wariness she did not understand. But it was the tour of the castle that caught her attention. The steward, a gray-haired man named Tomas, led her through the great hall, the chapel, the kitchens, the storehouses. At the far end of a long corridor past a row of tapestries showing hunts and battles, they came to a heavy oak door with a rusted lock. "And this?" Claire asked. Tomas hesitated. "That's the old study, my lady. It hasn't been opened in years, not since—" He stopped, as if he had said too much. "Not since when?" Claire pressed gently. Tomas looked down at his hands. "Not since the king's sister passed, my lady. It was her favorite room. He had it sealed after the funeral." Claire's breath caught. The king's sister? No one had mentioned her before. She looked at the door, at the rust on the lock, and felt something stir in her chest, a curiosity and a sadness she could not name. "Thank you, Tomas," she said quietly. "I won't disturb it." They moved on, but the door stayed in her mind, like a question she did not yet know how to ask. In the afternoon, the sky turned gray and a cold rain began to fall. Claire found herself in the kitchen, drying herbs at old Nan's direction, partly because she wanted something to do and partly because the warmth of the hearth was a comfort. Old Nan watched her work with shrewd eyes. "You know your herbs, girl." "My mother taught me," Claire said. "She used to make teas and salves for the village. She said the best medicine was patience and a steady hand." A wise woman. Old Nan stirred a pot that smelled of apples and cinnamon. The king's mother had the same touch, God rest her soul. She used to make a tea from yarrow and honey with a bit of meafon. Think what the season allowed. She said it settled the mind after a long day. Claire's hands stilled over the bundle of herbs. The king's mother? Aye, she was a gentle soul, that one. The king takes after her more than he'd like to admit. He was a quiet boy, always watching, always thinking. And after his sister... Old Nan stopped, shook her head. "Well, he closed himself off, but you can see it in him still, if you know where to look." Claire thought about the warm blanket laid over her shoulders in the dark hours before dawn. She thought about the man who had listened to her cry and not come closer, not because he did not care, but because he was trying to give her space. She thought about the scar on his arm and the boy who had not told her his name. "Do you know what herbs she used in that tea?" Claire asked. Old Nan looked at her for a long moment, then smiled, a crack in her usual stern facade. "I might remember if you've a mind to learn." The rain fell against the windows, and Claire dried herbs in the warm kitchen. And for the first time since she had arrived in this cold northern castle, she felt something that might have been the beginning of purpose. That evening, Edward did not come to dinner. Tomas said he had been called to the lower village, where a farmer's barn had collapsed in the storm. Claire ate alone in the small dining room, the candles flickering in the drafts, and wondered what he was doing out there in the rain. She was about to retire to her room when she heard the heavy door of the great hall open, and the sound of boots crossing the stone floor. She turned, and there he was, Edward, Alfre King of Thornwood, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, his cloak dripping water onto the flags. He stopped when he saw her, and for a moment they looked at each other across the length of the hall. "You're still awake," he said. His voice was low, roughened by the cold. "I was waiting to make sure you were safe," she said, and was surprised by her own honesty. Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps? Or something softer. He looked away first, toward the fire. The barn was old. No one was hurt. The farmer's family is staying with neighbors tonight. "That's good," Claire said. "I'm glad no one was hurt." The silence stretched between them, full of things neither of them knew how to say. Edward shifted his weight, and she saw his right arm move stiffly, the way it did when the cold settled into an old wound. "Your arm," she said, before she could stop herself. "It must pain you." In the rain, Edward looked down at his arm, then back at her. Something guarded came into his eyes. "It's an old scar. It aches sometimes." "It's nothing." Claire wanted to say more. She wanted to tell him that she knew how he had gotten that scar, that she had been there, that she had pulled him from the river and pressed her own cloth against the wound until the bleeding stopped. But the words stuck in her throat, and she could not find the courage to let them out. Instead, she said, "Old Nan told me about a tea that might help. Yarrow and honey, with a bit of mint. She said your mother used to make it." Edward went very still. The firelight caught his face, and she saw something raw pass through his expression, pain or memory, or both. For a long moment, he did not speak. "It's been a long time since anyone made that tea," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tomorrow," Claire said gently, "I'll make it for you, if you'd like." Edward looked at her, and in the low firelight, his amber eyes seemed almost gold. He did not smile, but something in his face softened, just a little. "I would like that," he said, and then he nodded, a small bow of his head, and turned to walk toward the stairs. Claire watched him go, her heart beating a little faster than it should have. She thought about the scar on his arm and the boy she had saved and the man he had become. She did not know if he would ever recognize her, but she knew suddenly that she wanted to stay. She wanted to learn who he was. She wanted to make him that tea and see if the ache in his arm and maybe the ache in his heart could be soothed by something as simple as patience and a steady hand. The fire crackled behind her as she climbed the stairs to her room, and for the first time since her wedding night, she did not feel quite so alone. Claire woke before dawn, to the sound of rain tapping against her window. The storm from the night before had softened into a steady drizzle, and the castle smelled of wet stone and cold air. She lay still for a moment, listening, and then she remembered she had promised him tea. She dressed quietly, not wanting to wake Marin, who was curled on a small cot by the hearth with a half-finished scarf tangled around her fingers. Claire smiled, pulled the blanket up over the girl's shoulder, and slipped out into the corridor with her candle held low. The kitchen was already warm when she reached it. Old Nan was there, stirring a pot of porridge with one hand and shooing a scullery boy away from the butter with the other. She looked up when Claire entered, and her wrinkled face broke into a knowing grin. "So you meant it," Old Nan said. "The king said you'd be down early. Guy told him that girl's got the look of someone who keeps her word. And here you are." Claire felt her cheeks warm. "Where does he keep the herbs?" Old Nan pointed to a wooden cabinet near the window, its doors carved with vines and acorns. "Top shelf, left side. The dried mallow is in the blue jar, and the honey is in the stone pot under the bench. His mother always put a pinch of dried mint in, too, said it helped the aches settle faster." Claire opened the cabinet and found the jars exactly where the old woman had said. The dried mallow was soft and gray-green, and the mint gave off a clean, sharp smell that reminded her of the meadow behind her father's house. She filled a small iron pot with water from the well bucket and hung it over the fire. "You knew his mother well?" Claire asked, keeping her voice light. Old Nan snorted. "Knew her better than I knew my own sister, God rest her soul. Lady Rosalind was the kind of woman who could calm a spooked horse with a word and make a grown man weep with a single loaf of bread. She had a way of feeding people that had nothing to do with food." She paused, and her hands stilled on the ladle. "The king took after her. He feeds people the same way, only he's forgotten how." Claire stirred the mallow into the water, watching the pale leaves darken as they steeped. "Forgotten how?" Old Nan was quiet for a long moment, then she said, "When you lose someone you love, miss, you can do one of two things. You can hold on to the way they fed you and pass it on. Or you can decide that feeding people only hurts when they're gone." She shook her head. "Our Edward—" She stopped, corrected herself. "The king. He chose the second way. For a long while now." Claire did not press. She added the mint and a spoonful of honey, and watched the steam rise in thin curls. The kitchen filled with a soft, sweet smell that seemed to push back the cold. She poured thick tea into a plain clay cup and set it on a wooden tray with a small loaf of yesterday's bread and a dish of butter. "I'll take it up to him," she said. Old Nan nodded, but her eyes were sharp. "He'll be in the east, solar, by the window. He doesn't sleep much after rain." She paused. "And miss, he's not used to someone bringing him things. Don't be hurt if he doesn't know what to do with it." Claire carried the tray through the winding corridors, past the great hall where servants were laying the long tables for breakfast, past the guardroom where Sir Aldrich stood sharpening a blade. He looked up as she passed, and his eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. She kept walking. The east solar was at the end of a narrow stone passage, its door slightly ajar. Claire paused, shifted the tray to one hip, and knocked gently. There was a long pause, and then Edward's voice came through, low and rough with disuse. "Enter." She pushed the door open. The room was small and plainly furnished. A writing desk, a low fire, a chair by the window where Edward sat with a book open on his knee. He was dressed in a simple tunic and breeches, his dark hair still damp from rain, and his right arm rested carefully on the armrest, as if he were cradling it. He looked up when she came in, and something flickered in his amber eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or wariness. "You came," he said. Claire set the tray down on the edge of the desk. "I said I would." She lifted the clay cup and held it out to him. "Old Nan said your mother used to put mint in it. I hope I got it right." Edward stared at the cup for a long moment. Then he reached out with his left hand to take it, and Claire noticed, with a small pang, that he did not move his right arm from the armrest. His fingers closed around the warm clay, and he breathed it to his lips. and he drank. The silence stretched. Claire watched his face, the way his brow smoothed, the way his shoulders lowered just a fraction. He drank again, slower. And then he set the cup down and looked at her with an expression she could not quite read. "It's right," he said quietly. "It tastes like—" He stopped. His throat moved. "Thank you." Claire smiled, and she felt something loosen in her chest. "You're welcome." She hesitated, then gestured to the bread. "Old Nan sent that along. She said you need to eat something before you go out." "I wasn't going out today," Edward said. He picked up the bread, tore off a piece, and ate it mechanically. "The rains brought the river up. The mill can't run until it goes down. And the millers come down with a fever. I was going to see if the village needs help preparing the roofs." Claire thought of the dry, warm solar, and the hard work waiting outside in the cold rain. She said, "I could help." Edward looked at her sharply. "You're the lady of the castle now. You don't need to be mending roofs." "I wasn't thinking of roofs," Claire said. "I was thinking of the miller's family. If he's sick, someone needs to bring them food. And the villagers—" She hesitated. "I've done a lot of carrying and fetching in my life. I'm not afraid of mud." Edward was quiet for a long while. He looked at her, and Claire had the strange feeling that he was seeing her for the first time. Not as the bride he had married out of duty, but as a person standing in his solar with a tray of bread and tea, offering to walk through the mud with him. "You don't have to earn your keep here," he said at last. "You're not a servant, Claire." The sound of her name in his voice, low, careful, almost unfamiliar, made her heart skip. She said, "I know I'm not a servant, but I married you and this is your land and your people. I'd like to help, if you'll let me." Edward held her gaze for a long moment. Then he set down the bread and said, "There's a wool cloak in the wardrobe by your room. It's heavy enough for the rain. Wear it." It was not quite a yes, but it was not a no either. Claire nodded and turned to go, and as she reached the door, she heard him speak again. "Claire." She stopped, looked back. He was still sitting by the window, his left hand resting on the book, his right arm still cradled against him. "The tea. It's the first thing that's tasted right in a long time." She smiled, and she did not know why her eyes felt suddenly hot. "Then I'll make it again tomorrow." She hurried back to her room, and she pulled the wool cloak from the wardrobe. Heavy, dark green, lined with soft gray fur that smelled of cedar and rain. She was fastening it at her throat when she noticed, at the foot of the bed, a small shape that had not been there before. A dog. A lean, rough-coated hound with one hind leg held up off the floor, watching her with wary amber eyes that were remarkably like Edward's. It did not bark. It simply sat, very still, as if waiting to see what she would do. Claire crouched down, keeping her hands visible. "Hello," she said softly. "Who are you?" The dog's tail gave a single, hesitant wag. It limped forward a step, then stopped, head low. Claire held it aligned, palm up, and waited. The dog sniffed her fingers, then her sleeve, and then, slowly, as if making a decision, it pressed its damp nose into her palm and let out a soft huff. "Bramble," came a voice from the door. Claire looked up. Edward stood in the doorway, a leather satchel over his shoulder, his face unreadable. "His name is Bramble," he said. "He belonged to—" He stopped. "He's been with me a long time." Claire looked back at the dog, who had settled now against her knee, his wounded legs stretched out awkwardly. She ran her fingers gently over his rough coat, and the dog closed his eyes. "He's very gentle," she said. Edward was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He didn't used to be. He was half wild when I found him, wouldn't let anyone near him." He paused. "He likes you. That's not something he does often." Claire looked up at him, and she saw something in his face that she had not seen before. Not the king, not the cold lord of the castle, but a man who had learned to be careful with things that were fragile. She said, "Maybe he knows I'm not a threat." Edward's lips twitched, almost a smile. "Maybe he does." They walked down to the village together, Edward and Claire and the limping dog, through the cold gray drizzle and the mud that sucked at their boots. Edward did not offer her his arm, and Claire did not ask for it, but he walked close enough that their shoulders nearly brushed, and he slowed his pace to match hers. And when they reached the first cottage with its leaking roof, he turned to her and said, "You don't have to come in. It'll be wet and crowded, and the smell will be terrible." Claire looked at him, at the rain beating on his dark lashes, at the way his right arm hung stiffly at his side. She said, "I've smelled worse things than a wet cottage," and she followed him inside. The family, a farmer, his wife, 3 small children, looked up in shock when the king entered their home. The farmer's wife dropped into a clumsy curtsy, and the children stared with round eyes. Edward's voice was quiet but firm as he asked about the roof, about the miller, about what they needed. He did not coax or think. Something. And Claire, standing in the doorway with the rain dripping off her cloak, watched him, and she felt her heart begin to soften in a way she had not expected. This was not the cold king of the wedding feast. This was a man who remembered the names of his people's children, who noticed that the farmer's wife had a cough, who knelt down to look a small boy in the eye and ask about his dog. When they left, the farmer's wife pressed a small loaf of rye bread into Claire's hands, insisting. Claire tried to refuse, but the woman said, "The king brought his lady to see us. That's worth more than bread, madam. Please." Claire looked at Edward, who was watching her with an unreadable expression. She took the bread, and she thanked the woman, and she tucked it into her cloak. They walked back to the castle in silence. The rain had stopped, and a pale sun was breaking through the clouds, turning the wet fields to gold. Bramble trotted ahead, his limp less noticeable now, his tail held higher. At the castle gate, Edward stopped. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, "You didn't have to come with me today, but you did?" Claire said. "I told you. I wanted to help." Edward nodded slowly. Something moved in his face, uncertainty maybe, or wonder. And then he said, very quietly, "I'm not used to people who want to stay." Claire looked at him, at this tall, guarded man who had carried his grief so long that he had forgotten it was there. She thought of the scar on his arm, and the boy she had saved by the river, and the man who had built walls around his heart to keep loss out. "Maybe," she said softly, "you just haven't met the right people." And she walked past him into the castle, the rye bread warm against her chest, and behind her she heard Edward think out a long, slow breath, like a man setting down a weight he had carried for far too long. The days after the village visit settled into a quiet rhythm, and Claire found herself learning the shape of the castle the way one learns the shape of a new home, by the creak of certain floorboards, the slant of afternoon light through the narrow windows, the smell of wood smoke and old stone. She also learned the shape of Bramble. The limping hound had taken to following her at a distance, his good ear cocked, his tail giving a slow, uncertain wag whenever she looked his way. He did not bound up to her the way other dogs might. He waited, as if he had learned long ago that most people did not want a half-broken creature pressing close. On the 4th morning, Claire carried her breakfast tray out to the small stone courtyard behind the kitchens and sat on the low wall breaking off pieces of bread to share. Bramble appeared from the shadow of the well, watched her for a long moment, and then came to sit at her feet, his warm head resting against her knee. "You are a gentleman," Claire said softly, scratching behind his ears. "A very polite, very serious gentleman." The dog made a sound somewhere between a sigh and a grumble, and leaned his whole weight against her leg. Claire laughed, and it felt like the first real laugh she had let out since arriving at Thornwood. "You know," came a voice from the kitchen doorway, "that dog hasn't let anyone touch him since he came here, not even the king." Old Nan stood with her arms folded, a flour-dusted apron tied over her worn woolen dress. Her sharp eyes softened as she watched Claire's hand move in slow circles over the hound's rough coat. "Bramble is His Majesty's dog?" Claire asked. "He's nobody's dog, and everybody's," Old Nan said, thinking to sit on the wall beside her. "Found him half-drowned in the river years back. Leg was broken bad. The king's sister was the one who pulled him out. God rest her soul." Claire's hand stilled. "The king's sister?" "Aye, Lady Eleanor." Old Nan's voice dropped, and she looked out across the courtyard as if she could see something Claire could not. Bright as spring that girl was. Used to run through these halls with mud on her skirts and a wildflower in her hair, laughing at nothing at all. The king, he was different then. Not so much stone. Claire did not speak. She had learned that sometimes the kindest thing was to let silence do the listening. "She went to the river one winter morning," Old Nan went on, her voice flat and old. "There was a lamb stuck on the ice. She went out to save it. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. The words hung in the cold air. Claire felt the bread go dry in her mouth. She looked down at Bramble, at the scarred leg and the patient eyes, and understood with a sudden aching clarity that this dog was not just a pet. He was a memory made flesh, a living piece of someone who was gone. How long ago? Claire asked quietly. 11 winters. Old Nan stood, brushing crumbs from her apron. The king doesn't speak of her, doesn't even come near this part of the castle much, but he keeps that dog fed and warm, and he never once let anyone put the poor creature down, even when the leg would have healed cleaner without it. She looked at Claire with something like approval. You're good with him. That's a thing not many can claim. Claire touched the hound's head. He's easy to love. Aye, Old Nan said, and her voice was gentler than Claire had heard it. That's the thing about the ones who've been hurt. They make it easy to love them, if you're willing to look past the limp. She went back inside, and Claire sat with Bramble in the quiet morning, running her fingers through his coarse fur, thinking about a girl named Eleanor who had died saving a lamb, and a brother who had carried the weight of that loss for 11 years without ever putting it down. Later that afternoon, Claire found herself wandering toward the older wing of the castle, the part where the tapestries were faded and the doors were kept shut. She was not looking for anything in particular. She was simply walking the way one does when the mind is full and the body needs to move. Bramble padded beside her, his claws clicking on the worn stone. He seemed to know where he was going, his nose low to the ground, his tail no longer wagging but held steady like a compass, needle pointing true. They passed a row of closed doors. Claire had assumed they were storage rooms, or quarters for servants who had long since moved to warmer parts of the keep. But Bramble stopped at the third door, sat down, and let out a single, low whine. Claire looked at the door. It was older than the others, the wood dark with age, the iron handle rusted at the edges. There was no lock, only a heavy latch. Bramble, she said softly, what's in there? The dog looked up at her, then back at the door, and whined again. Claire hesitated. She had been taught that a lady did not pry into the private rooms of a great house, but there was something in the dog's patient waiting, the way he sat as if he had done this many times before, that made her feel she was not trespassing so much as being invited. She lifted the latch and pushed the door open. Dust motes swirled in the pale light. The room beyond was small, a child's chamber, untouched by time. A narrow bed with a think quilt, a wooden chest at the foot, its lid closed, a shelf of books with cracked spines, and on the wall above the bed, a charcoal drawing of a dog, a puppy, really, with one leg wrapped in a bandage and a lopsided smile scratched into the charcoal. Claire stepped closer. The drawing was signed in a child's unsteady hand. Bramble, my brave boy. Her throat tightened. So the dog had been Eleanor's. Eleanor had drawn him, had bandaged his leg, had loved him. And when she died, Edward had kept the dog, kept this room, kept the drawing, kept everything, and told no one. She stood in the dusty light, her heart aching for the tall, guarded man who had said, I'm not used to people who want to stay. He had lost his sister, and he had built a wall around himself so high that even the memory of love could not climb over it. Bramble came to stand beside her, pressing his warm head against her hand. She knelt down, and for the first time she noticed the collar around his neck, an old leather strap, worn smooth with years. She turned it gently, and there, stamped into the leather, was a name. Eleanor. Claire's breath caught. She looked at the word, then at the drawing, then at the dog, who had waited at this door for 11 years, and she understood something she had not understood before. This was not just a room. It was a shrine, and Edward had built it, not out of guilt, but out of love. Love he could not speak, could not show, could not even admit to himself, because admitting it would mean admitting that he had lost something he could never get back. She did not take the collar off. She did not take anything from the room. She simply closed the door as softly as she had opened it and let Bramble lead her back toward the part of the castle where the light was brighter. She did not tell anyone what she had found. Some doors, she thought, were not meant to be opened by force. Some doors only opened when the person on the other side was ready to step through. That evening, Claire sat in the great hall as the servants cleared the supper tables. Edward had not come down to eat. Marin said he often took his meals alone in his study when the weight of the day pressed too heavily on him. "He does that," Marin said, stacking plates with practice ease. "Goes quiet as a stone. You'd think he was carved out of the mountain itself." "He's not made of stone," Claire said quietly. "He just learned to stand very still so no one would see him shake." Marin paused, looked at her, and then smiled. "You know, my lady, that's the first thing anyone said about him that sounded true." Claire smiled, but she did not answer. She was thinking about the room with the charcoal drawing and the collar with the name stamped into the leather, and the man who had carried his grief for so long that he had forgotten it was there. Later, when the hall was empty and the candles had burned low, Claire walked to the window that overlooked the castle yard. The night was clear and cold, the stars sharp as ice. She saw him then, a tall figure on horseback returning through the gate. Edward. He rode alone, as he always did, his cloak dark against the pale frost. Bramble was waiting by the stable door, and when Edward dismounted, the dog limped forward and pressed against his leg. Edward did not bend down. He did not speak. But he reached down once and let his hand rest on the dog's head for a long moment. Then he walked into the castle, and the door closed behind him. Claire stood at the window, her hand pressed to the cold glass, and felt something shift in her chest. She thought of the scar on his arm and the boy she had saved by the river, and the man who had lost his sister and built walls around his heart to keep loss out. She had found a door he had kept shut for 11 years, and she had chosen, in that dusty room, not to open it, not because she was afraid, but because she understood that some doors only open from the inside. Bramble had followed her to the window. He sat at her feet, his warm weight against her ankle, and whined softly, as if he too understood that the man outside was not made of stone. He was just a man who had been standing very still for a very long time, waiting for someone to see him without flinching. Claire reached down and scratched behind the dog's ears. "It's all right," she whispered. "We can wait." The invitation came not as a command, but as a quiet suggestion spoken over the evening meal that old Nan had insisted they share together in the small solar. "There is a grove of oaks beyond the north wall," Edward said, setting down his cup. "The leaves are turning, if you would like to see them before they fall." Claire looked up from her plate. In the 5 days since the wedding, she had learned to read the small movements of his face, the way he did not meet her eyes when he asked, the way his thumb traced the rim of his cup, the way he had already decided to go alone if she said no. "I would like that very much," she said. They walked in silence through the castle yard, past the kitchens, where old Nan was singing to herself, past the stables where a groom was brushing down a bay mare. Bramble limped along beside Claire, his crooked leg barely slowing him, his nose busy with every scent the evening wind carried. The north wall was older than the rest of the castle, its stones darker and rougher, grown over wit. Thinking life with a gogol o' moss that glowed green in the low light. Beyond it, the ground sloped gently downward into a hollow where the oaks stood in a loose circle, their leaves a riot of gold and rust and deep amber. Edward stopped at the edge of the grove. He did not look at her. "My mother used to bring us here," he said, "Eleanor and me. She said the oaks were the oldest souls in Thornwood, and that if you listened quietly enough, they would tell you what you needed to hear." Claire waited. She had learned that he spoke in fragments, and that each fragment was a door he chose to open. Eleanor believed her. She would sit for hours with her back against the largest tree, her eyes closed, her lips moving silently. She said the oaks spoke in pictures, not words. His voice caught, just slightly, on his sister's name. He cleared his throat and walked forward into the grove, his boots pressing into the carpet of fallen leaves. "The winter she died. She came here alone," he said. "There was a storm the night before. The river by the mill had frozen over, and a lamb had wandered onto the ice. She saw it from the window and ran out before anyone could stop her." The story came out slowly, each sentence dragged up from somewhere deep. He stood beneath the largest oak, his palm flat against the rough bark, as if drawing strength from the old tree. She reached the lamb. She carried it back to the bank, but the ice broke beneath her own weight on the way across. Claire felt the cold of that river settle into her own bones. She did not speak. She only stepped closer, until she stood beside him under the oak. "I was supposed to be watching her," Edward said. "Our mother had gone to the village to tend to a sick woman. She left Eleanor in my care. I was 11. I thought she was old enough to be trusted. Ill alone for an hour." He turned to look at her then, and his eyes were the color of the leaves around them, amber and rust, and something darker, something that had been buried for a long time. "They found her downstream past the mill. She was still holding the lamb. The lamb survived. Eleanor did not." Claire's throat tightened. She thought of the scar on his arm, the one she had seen on their wedding night, the one that ran from elbow to wrist like a river on a map. "Your arm," she said softly. "The scar." Edward looked down at his sleeve, then slowly pushed it up. The scar was pale against his skin now, 11 years healed but still visible, a thin white line that caught the fading light. "I tried to reach her," he said. "I ran after her, across the ice. I was almost to her when it broke under me too. I caught the edge, but I couldn't hold on. A piece of the broken ice cut my arm open." His voice dropped to a whisper. "I watched her go under. I could not reach her in time. I have never been able to reach anyone in time since." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and cold. Claire understood now why he had built his walls so high, why he kept everyone at such a careful distance. He had spent 11 years believing that his own slowness, his own smallness, had cost his sister her life. She did not say that it was not his fault. She did not say that he had been only a child. She did not say any of the things that she knew would sound like comfort but would land like accusation. Instead, she reached out and took his hand. He stiffened at the touch. His fingers were cold, his palm rough with calluses from years of sword work, but he did not pull away. "You were 11 years old," Claire said quietly. "You ran onto broken ice to save your sister. That is not the act think someone who failed. That is the act of someone who loved her more than he feared the cold." Edward's breath caught. He looked down at their joined hands, at her smaller fingers wrapped around his. "I have told no one that story," he said. "Not Aldrich, not my mother's ghost, not the priest who came to the funeral. I have carried it alone for 11 years. "I know," Claire said, "and I am sorry that you had to." She did not let go of his hand. She could feel the tremor in his fingers, the way he was holding himself very still, the way he was fighting to keep the wall standing. "You do not need to carry it alone anymore," she said. "Not with me." The wind moved through the oaks above them, and a handful of golden leaves drifted down, settling on their shoulders like a blessing. Edward looked at her for a long moment. His eyes moved over her face, her gray-blue eyes, the small mole on her left cheek, the way her hair caught the last of the light. "You looked at me on our wedding night," he said. "You were crying. I thought you were afraid of me. I thought you had seen the scar, and the cold, and the years of walls, and you were crying because you had been bound to a man made of stone." Claire shook her head slowly. "I was not crying because I was afraid," she said. "Then why?" She let go of his hand and reached up very gently to touch his cheek. His skin was warm beneath her fingers, warmer than she had expected. "Because I saw the scar," she said, "and I recognized it, and I knew that whoever had carried that scar had been through something terrible, and that they had carried it alone for a very long time." Edward's eyes widened. His hand came up, almost involuntarily, to cover hers where it rested against his cheek. "Recognized it," he repeated. "How could you recognize a scar you had never seen?" Claire's breath caught in her throat. She had not meant to say so much. The words had slipped out before she could stop them, and now she stood at the edge of a truth she was not yet ready to tell. She hesitated, her hand trembling slightly against his cheek. "I knew a boy once, by a river. A long time ago. He had a scar like that." Edward's face went very still. The wind moved through the oaks again, louder this time, as if the old trees were leaning in to listen. "A boy? By a river?" he repeated slowly. "When?" Claire pulled her hand back, wrapping her arms around herself as if to hold the secret in. She was not ready. Not yet. The truth of who she was, of what she had done, of the silver coin and the oak tree and the mother who had passed through this land, it was too large to lay out in the fading light of a single evening. "Another time," she said softly. I will tell you another time, I promise. Edward studied her for a long moment. She could see the questions in his eyes, the hunger to know, the fear of what the knowing might cost, but he did not press her. Another time then, he said. I will wait. He said it the way he had said, I don't like company on their wedding night, and the way he had said, I don't want to be less alone in the dusty old room. He said it like a man who was learning, slowly, that waiting for someone was not the same as being left behind. They walked back to the castle as the last of the light drained from the sky. Bramble limped between them, his leash loose, his nose busy with the evening scents. Neither of them spoke, but their horns brushed once, twice, and on the third time Edward did not pull away. At the gate, Sir Aldrich was waiting. His arms were crossed, his face unreadable in the shadows. Your Grace, he said, his eyes moving from Edward to Claire and back again. The steward has news from the southern villages. There is a matter that requires your attention. Edward nodded. He turned to Claire, and for a moment something passed between them. A wordless understanding, a thread that had been spun in the grove of oaks and would not easily be broken. Go inside, he said. Old Nan will have something warm in the kitchens. I will join you when I can. Claire nodded and turned toward the keep, but before she went inside, she looked back over her shoulder. Edward was still standing at the gate, watching her. The torchlight caught his face, and for the first time since she had met him, she saw something other than stone and shadow in his eyes. She saw a man who had been standing very still for a very long time, waiting for someone to see him without flinching. And she had seen him. The door closed behind her, and she pressed her hand to her chest where the old silver coin hung on its chain beneath her dress. She thought of the boy by the river, and the scar on his arm, and the words that had almost spilled out of her in the grove. Not yet, she told herself, but soon. The southern villages had not fared well that autumn. Sir Aldrich's news, delivered in the gatehouse with the low gravity of a man who had seen hard winters, was that the harvest had been thin and the granaries leaner than anyone had admitted. Edward had listened without interruption, his jaw tight, and then he had gone to the war room and closed the door. Claire had not been invited. She did not expect to be, but she had stood in the corridor for a long moment, watching the oak door settle into its frame. And she had felt the weight of the kingdom settle onto her shoulders as well. She was the Alpin, Hectare's, king's wife now. Whatever burden he carried, it was hers to understand, even if he would not yet let her share it. She found herself wandering that afternoon, as she often did when the castle grew too quiet. Her steps carried her past the kitchens, where old Nan was kneading dough with a ferocity that suggested she had heard the news too, and up the narrow stone stair that led to the older part of the keep. She had not been this way before. The corridor here was dimmer, the tapestries older and faded, and the air smelled of dust and dried lavender and something else. Paper, old ink, the ghost of a fire long gone cold. The door at the end of the corridor was slightly ajar. Claire hesitated. She was the lady of the castle now, and she had been given the freedom of the keep, but there was something about this particular door that felt private, almost sacred. She pushed it open gently, and the light from a narrow window fell across a room that had clearly not been used in years. It was a study. A heavy oak desk sat against the far wall, its surface covered in a thin layer of dust. Shelves lined the walls, crammed with books and scrolls, and the kind of clutter that accumulated when someone lived in a room and then left it suddenly, as if they had meant to return any moment. Claire stepped inside, her skirts brushing the floor and leaving a faint trail in the dust. She touched the spine of a book, then another. They were mostly ledgers and histories, the kind of dry records that kings kept and no one else read. But in the corner of the desk, weighted down by a small brass candlestick, was a stack of letters. The handwriting on the top envelope was elegant and feminine. The ink faded to a soft brown. Claire picked it up carefully, her fingers trembling slightly. The letter was addressed to my dearest husband, and the seal on the back was a pressed flower, a small, dried violet, still faintly purple after all these years. She knew she should not read it, but the handwriting, the pressed flower, the way the envelopes had been left so carefully as if waiting for someone to come back, she could not turn away. The letters were from Edward's mother, Claire sat down in the worn leather chair behind the desk and she read them all. They were not the letters of a queen, but of a woman. Rosalind of Thornwood had written to her husband about the weather, about the apple trees in the orchard, about a small dog that had followed her son home and would not be shaken off. She wrote about Edward as a boy with scraped knees and a stubborn chin, about his little sister Eleanor who sang to the sheep, about the way the two of them would argue over the last piece of honey cake at supper. There was no grand tragedy in these pages, no hint of the sorrow that had settled over the family like a fog, only the ordinary tender record of a woman who had loved her children fiercely and had not known she would be taken from them so soon. The last letter was dated 11 years ago, only a few weeks before Eleanor's death. Rosalind had written that she was worried about her daughter, who had grown quiet and distant. "She spends too much time by the river," the letter said. "She says she is looking for something, but she will not tell me what. I fear she carries a weight that no child should carry alone." Claire read the sentence twice, then a third time. Her hands were cold now, and the room seemed to have grown darker, though the afternoon light still slanted through the window. She had been by that river. She had been that child. Once. Watching a boy slip beneath ice and pulling him out with her own frozen hands. But Eleanor had been there too, in her own way, at a different time, and whatever weight the girl had carried, whatever she had been looking for, no one had found it before it was too late. Claire folded the letter carefully and returned it to its envelope. She did not take any of them with her, but she could not shake the feeling that she had been given a piece of a puzzle she had not known she was trying to solve. She was still sitting in the chair when the door opened. Edward stood in the doorway, his silhouette filling the frame. The light from the corridor behind him cast his face in shadow, but she could see the flicker of surprise in his posture, the way his hand tightened on the door frame. "I did not know anyone used this room," he said. His voice was flat, but there was something underneath it, a current she had not heard before. Claire rose quickly, smoothing her skirts. "I am sorry. I was wandering, and the door was open. I should not have. It was my mother's study." The words fell between them like stones into still water. Edward stepped into the room, and the light caught his face now, showing the tightness around his eyes, the way he held himself very still, as if the room itself were fragile. "I know," Claire said softly. "I read her letters. I am sorry. I should not have." He did not answer at once. He walked to the desk and touched the corner of the stack of envelopes, his fingers brushing the dust. "She used to sit here in the evenings," he said. "She would write to my father when he was away, and she would read to Eleanor and me from the histories, and she would tell us that the Thornwood Oaks had been standing for 1,000 years, and that we would stand for 1,000 more. His voice cracked on his sister's name, just slightly, and he looked away. Claire stepped closer. She did not touch him, but she stood near enough that she could feel the warmth of him, the rigid tension in his shoulders. "You loved her very much," she said. "She was the only person who never looked at me like I was the Alpha King," Edward said. "She looked at me like I was just Edward, like I was enough." The silence stretched between them, filled with the dust motes drifting in the afternoon light. Claire thought of the letter again, the worry in Rosalind's words about her daughter, the weight that no child should carry alone. She thought of the boy she had pulled from the river, and the scar on his arm, and the way he had held himself apart from the world ever since. "Edward," she said, and he turned to look at her. She saw the guardedness in his eyes, the fear that she would say something that would break the fragile trust they had built. She wanted to tell him everything then. She wanted to tell him about the river, about the boy, about the silver coin that hung against her heart. But the words would not come. She was afraid too, afraid of what it would mean if she told him, afraid that he would look at her differently, afraid that the careful bridge they had built would collapse under the weight of the past. "I think," she said instead, "that she would be glad you are still here, that you kept her study, and her letters, and her memory." Edward's breath caught. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he reached out and took her hand. His palm was warm and rough, calloused from sword and reins, and he held her fingers as if they were something precious. "Thank you," he said, "for not running away." She did not know what he meant. She did not ask. She simply held his hand and let silence settle around them like a blanket, and for a moment the old study felt less like a tomb and more like a place that could hold new life. The moment was broken by a knock at the door. Sir Aldrich's voice came through the wood, urgent and low. "Your Majesty, the grain shipments from the southern villages, they are worse than we thought. You are needed in the war room." Edward's hand tightened on hers. and then he released it. "I must go," he said. But he did not move immediately. He looked at her, and there was something new in his eyes, something that had not been there before. "Stay," he said. "If you wish. The study is yours." He left before she could answer, and the door closed behind him with a soft click. Claire stood alone in the dim room, surrounded by the dust and the letters and the ghost of a woman she had never met. She touched the silver coin beneath her dress, and she thought of the boy by the river, and the scar on his arm, and the weight he had carried alone for 11 years. She would not let him carry it longer, but she needed to find the right words and the right time, and the courage to speak a truth that might change everything between them. She crossed to the window and looked out at the thornwood oaks, their leaves turning gold and red in the fading light. Somewhere beyond the walls, the southern villages were hungry, and the kingdom was waiting for its king to make a decision that would affect them all. And Claire, the Alpha King's wife, pressed her palm against the cold stone of the window frame and promised herself that when the time came, she would not look away. The kitchens of Thornwood Castle had never known silence, and on the 7th day of the southern famine, they hummed like a disturbed hive. Claire stood at the long oak table, thanked with old Nan, working dried peas into a thin stew that would have to feed twice as many mouths as it had been meant for. Her fingers, used to fine needlework, split open at the knuckles from the coarse grain, and she wrapped them in a strip of linen without complaint. "You have a soft hand for a lady," old Nan observed, not unkindly. She slid a second pot toward Claire, filled with barley and the last of the autumn onions. "The king's mother, God rest her, had hands like yours, gentle, but she learned to grip a ladle when the harvest failed." Claire paused. It was the first time anyone had spoken of Edward's mother to her without sorrow in the voice, as if the woman were simply a memory to be shared rather than a wound to be guarded. She stirred the barley and asked, very quietly, "Did she? Grip a ladle, I mean." "Every autumn of her life, my lady." Ohm wiped her hands on her apron and nodded toward the far wall where a series of iron hooks hung empty. "She'd hide her own herbs there, same as you do," said it kept the castle honest. She looked at Claire with a knowing eye. "You remind me of her more each day." Claire felt the silver coin press against her chest beneath her dress, a small cold weight that had grown familiar over the years. She had worn it since her mother's death, had rubbed its edges smooth with worry and longing, had never once asked herself why the oak tree carved into its back felt so much like home. Now, standing in the kitchens of Thornwood, she could not shake the thought that the answer was closer than she had ever allowed herself to believe. The afternoon brought a steady stream of villagers to the castle gates. They came with empty sacks and tired eyes, and Claire stood beside the granary door with the steward, measuring out what little could be spared. She did not speak much, she simply looked at each face as she handed over the grain, and she found that the looking mattered more than any words she might have offered. An old woman with a shawl over her head clutched Claire's hand and said, "Bless you, my lady," and Claire felt the coin press against her skin as if it were listening. Near dusk, when the last of the villagers had gone and the castle yard had fallen quiet, Claire found herself standing before the great hall's fireplace. The thornwood crest was carved into the stone above the mantel, a single oak tree, its roots spread wide, its branches reaching toward the sky. She had seen it 100 times since her arrival, had thought it merely a pretty emblem of the house she had married into. Now, with the coin in her palm, she looked at the carving and then at the silver, and her breath caught in her throat. The oak on the coin was the same, not similar, the same twisting trunk, the same 3 branches on the left, the same small bird perched on the uppermost limb as if it had been copied from the very stone. "My lady?" Marin appeared in the doorway, a half-finished scarf trailing from her hands. "You look as if you've seen a ghost." Claire closed her fist around the coin and forced a smile. "Just tired, Marin. It has been a long day," but her heart was beating hard against her ribs, and she could not stop looking at the oak tree on the wall. Edward did not return to the castle until the moon was high. Claire heard his boots on the stone stairs long before he reached her door, and she stood with her hand on the latch, uncertain whether to open or wait. She had not meant to confront him tonight, not with the grain still short and the villages still hungry, but the coin was burning to her pocket, and the questions had been piling up like autumn leaves. When the footsteps stopped outside her door, she opened it. Edward stood in the corridor, his face shadowed with exhaustion, his cloak still damp from the night air. He looked at her, and something in his expression softened. "You should be asleep, Claire." "So should you." She stepped aside to let him in, and he crossed to the window without sitting. Looking out at the darkened fields, she watched the set of his shoulders, the way he held himself, as if the weight of the kingdom were a physical thing he had learned to carry. And she thought, not for the first time, that he had been carrying it alone for far too long. "I went to the southern villages today," he said quietly. "The harvest failed there before the frost. The granaries are nearly empty, and the river is too low for the mill to run." He turned to face her, and his eyes were tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. "I do not know how to feed them, Claire. I have raided every storehouse in the north, and it is still not enough." She crossed the room to stand beside him, close enough to feel the cold radiating from his cloak. "What did the village elders say?" "They said what they always say, that the king will find a way." He let out a breath that was almost a laugh, but there was no humor in it. "The king has no more way than they do. I am only a man with a title and a sword, and neither one can make bread from frost." Claire reached for his hand without thinking. His fingers were cold, and they closed around hers with a gentleness that surprised her. She looked down at the scar that ran along his forearm, pale in the moonlight, and she thought of the boy by the river and the words she had never found the courage to say. "I have been thinking about your mother," she said softly. "Old Nan told me she used to feed the village from this castle in the bad years, that she hung her own herbs in the kitchen and said it kept the castle honest." Edward's grip on her hand tightened, just slightly. "She did. Every year, when the harvest was thin, she would be the first to empty her own plate. She said a queen who ate while her people starved was no queen at all." His voice dropped. "I have been trying to live up to that all my life, and I have never once felt that I came close." "You have?" Claire said. "You are here, Edward. You are standing in this castle, worrying about people whose names you do not even know. That is more than most kings ever do." She paused. And then, because the coin was heavy in her pocket and the oak tree on the wall seemed to be watching, she pulled it out and held it up to the moonlight. "I have been carrying this since my mother died. I never knew where it came from, only that she said it was a gift from a kind stranger who once gave her shelter from the rain." Edward's eyes fixed on the coin, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then he reached out and took it from her palm, turning it over in his fingers with a reverence that made her breath catch. "This is my mother's," he said, and his voice was hoarse. "I would know it anywhere. She wore it on a chain every day of her life. She said it was a token of a promise she had made, though she never told me what the promise was." He looked up at Claire, and there was something raw in his eyes, something she had never seen before. "How did you come to have this, Claire?" She opened her mouth to answer, but the words would not come. Because she knew, suddenly, with a certainty that settled into her bones like cold water, that the kind stranger who had sheltered her mother was Rosalind Thornwood herself, and the promise that the coin represented was tied to the very thing she had been too afraid to say. "I do not know," she whispered. "My mother never told me the stranger's name, only that she was a woman with kind eyes and an oak tree on her gate." Edward was very still. The coin lay in his palm, catching the moonlight, and the oak tree on its back seemed to glow. "An oak tree on her gate," he repeated. "That would have been the old gate, before my father had it replaced. My mother had the oak carved into every door and lintel in the castle. She said it was to remind us that we were rooted to the earth, no matter how high we built our walls." He closed his hand around the coin and looked at Claire, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. The fire crackled in the hearth, and the wind moved through the oaks outside the window, and Claire felt as if the whole world had narrowed to the space between them. "Claire," Edward said, and his voice was so low she had to lean in to hear it. "Where is your mother now? She died when I was 15. Claire swallowed. "She never told me the full story of that day, only that the coin was the most precious thing she owned, and that one day, if I ever found the oak tree on a gate, I would know I was home." Edward's eyes glistened in the firelight. He pressed the coin back into her palm and closed her fingers around it, his own hand warm over hers. "Then I think you have found it," he said. "This is your home, Claire. It has been from the moment you arrived, whether you knew it or not." She wanted to tell him then. She wanted to say, "I am the girl from the river. I am the one who bound your wound when we were children. I have carried that memory and thought so. Think, coin, and the weight of your sorrow for 11 years. And I am so tired of carrying it alone." But the words stuck in her throat, and the moment passed. Edward released her hand and stepped back, and the distance between them felt like a chasm she did not know how to cross. "I should let you rest," he said. "Tomorrow, I will send riders to the eastern villages. They may have grain to spare." He paused at the door and looked back at her, his face half in shadow. "Thank you, Claire, for the grain, and for the kindness you showed the villagers today. My mother would have liked you." He was gone before she could answer, and Claire stood alone in the room with the coin warm in her palm, and the oak tree watching from the wall. She pressed the silver to her lips and closed her eyes, and she made herself a promise. She would find the courage to tell him. She would find the words. She would not let him carry the weight alone any longer, even if the truth changed everything between them. But as she lay down to sleep, the coin still clutched in her hand, she could not help wondering what promise her mother had made to a woman with kind eyes and an oak tree on her gate, and whether that promise had been the reason Claire had been sent to the river on that cold autumn day 11 years ago, to find a boy with a wound and a sorrow she had carried with her ever since. The hunger came like a slow tide, and then, all at once. By the third week of the frost, the castle's storerooms had fallen to barely a third of what they needed to last the winter. The grain that old Nan had measured so carefully each morning now sat in shallow, sad piles at the bottom of the great bins, and the miller had taken to sweeping the floorboards just to gather the dust that might still hold a mouthful of flour. Edward had stopped taking his evening meat, though no one dared remark on it. Claire noticed the way his plate came back to the kitchen with the portion untouched. And she noticed, too, the way his shoulders had begun to carry a weight that had nothing to do with the sword at his hip. She found him in the great hall on the morning of the first true snowfall, staring at a map of the territories spread across the long oak table. His finger traced the river that ran through the southern farms, the same river where she had once knelt on a cold autumn day to bind a boy's bleeding arm. "The southern fields have nothing left," he said without looking up. "The frost came too early. The harvest was half of what we needed, even in a good year." Claire came to stand beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. She had learned, in the weeks since their wedding, that he did not flinch from her presence the way he once had. Small mercies, old Nan called them. Claire called them hope. "There are still the northern orchards," she offered, "the apples that were stored in the cellars. If we ration them carefully. I have already sent word to the northern villages." He straightened, and for a moment she saw the exhaustion beneath his composure, the deep lines that had not been there on their wedding night. "The news is not good. The frost has reached even the high pastures. The sheep are dying in the hills." Claire thought of the lambs she had named as a girl, the soft warmth of them in her arms. The way their bleating had always seemed to her like a question asked of the world. She did not know why that memory came to her now, only that it made the weight in her chest heavier. "Then we go to the villages," she said quietly. "We go and we see for ourselves, and we let them know that the castle has not forgotten them." Edward looked at her then, and there was something in his eyes that she had not seen before. Not the cold authority of the Alpha King, not the guarded distance of a man who had learned too young that caring meant losing. It was something softer, more uncertain, something that looked almost like wonder. "My mother did that," he said. "When I was a boy, there was a bad year. Not as bad as this, but bad enough. She walked the villages herself, with baskets of bread and a pot of her own stew. She said a queen's first duty was to be seen when it mattered most." Claire's breath caught. "Old Nan told me about her. She said your mother used to hang herbs in the kitchen herself." "She did." A ghost of a smile crossed his face, there and gone. "She said the smell of rosemary meant the castle was alive. She said a home that smelled of cooking was a home that would not break." They stood in silence for a long moment, the map between them, the snow falling past the tall windows in soft, relentless flakes. Claire wanted to tell him then. She wanted to take his hand and say, "I was the girl by the river. I was the one who bound your arm with the hem of my dress." But the words stayed locked behind her teeth, and she hated herself for the cowardice of it. "Will you come with me?" Edward asked. "To the villages. I think they need to see that the Thornwood line still stands and that it stands with someone who cares." It was the closest he had come to asking for her company as something more than duty. Claire nodded, and she did not trust her voice to speak. They rode out that afternoon, Edward on his dark warhorse and Claire on a gentle bay mare that old Nan had insisted was the calmest in the stables. The snow had stopped by then, but the AI thing was sharp and cold, and the ground crunched beneath the horse's hooves like the breaking of thin ice. Sir Aldrich rode ahead with 2 guards, his face set in its usual stern lines, though Claire noticed that he glanced back at her more often than he used to, and that the glance no longer carried the old suspicion. The first village they came to was nearly empty. A few old men sat by the communal fire, wrapped in threadbare cloaks, their faces turned toward the flames as if the warmth itself were a kind of prayer. The women who remained had gathered the last of the children in a single longhouse, and they looked up at Edward and Claire with eyes that were tired but not afraid. Claire had brought what she could carry in her saddlebags: dried herbs, a small pouch of the precious salt, the last of the honey that old Nan had been hoarding for the winter. She did not announce herself. She simply went to the women, sat down among them, and began to help the eldest of them sort a pile of withered roots that would have to stretch further than it should. Edward watched her for a long moment. Then he knelt by the fire and began to talk with the old men, his voice low and steady, asking about their herds, their wells, their grandchildren. He did not make promises he could not keep. He did not offer false comfort. He simply listened, and Claire saw the old men's shoulders ease, just slightly, just enough. By the time they rode back to the castle, the sky had turned a bruised purple, and the first stars were pricking through the cold. Claire's hands were numb inside her gloves, and her heart was full to aching with the weight of what she had seen. The hunger was not a distant thing, a problem for the castle to solve with ledgers and grain counts. It was in the faces of the old men by the fire, in the thin arms of the children, in the way the women had divided the last of the roots into portions too small to feed a single child. Edward reined in his horse at the top of the rise that overlooked the castle, and Claire drew up beside him. For a long moment he said nothing, just looked at the gray stone walls and the thin smoke rising from the chimneys, the snow on the battlements catching the last light. "My sister used to say that the castle looked like a sleeping giant," he said at last, his voice rough. "She said it was waiting for the right moment to wake up and be kind." Claire's heart turned over. It was the first time he had spoken of his sister in her presence, the first time he had offered that name, that memory, as if it were something he did not usually share. "Eleanor," she said softly, and she saw him flinch, just barely, the way a man flinches at a wound he thought had healed. "Yes." He did not look at her. "Eleanor, she was younger than me. She used to follow me everywhere, even when I told her to stay behind. She said I needed someone to make sure I didn't get too serious." Claire remembered the boy by the river, the one with the wounded arm and the sorrow in his eyes. She had not known his name then, had not known he was the heir to Thornwood. She had only known that he was hurt and that someone needed to help him. "What happened to her?" she asked, and the question was softer than she had intended, a thread of a thing that might break at the slightest pull. Edward was silent for so long that she thought he would not answer. Then he said very quietly, "She drowned. In the river, near the southern bend. She was trying to save a lamb that had fallen through the ice." The words hung in the cold air between them, heavy and final. Claire Fiend, Virtue, Fixness, prayer settled and supporting extraing Disash inside her, a piece of the puzzle sliding into place with a click that was almost audible. "The river," she repeated. "The southern bend." Yes, Edward's voice was flat, emptied of something that had been there a moment before. "I was supposed to be watching her. I was supposed to keep her safe. I was on the other side of the field, and I did not see her go down to the water until it was too late." He did not say the rest, but Claire heard it in the silence. "I have carried this guilt ever since. I have told myself it was my fault, that I should have been faster, stronger, more vigilant, and I have never told anyone. Not like this. Not until now." She wanted to reach out and take his hand. She wanted to tell him the truth, the whole truth, that she had been there, that she had seen the boy by the river, that the wound on his arm had been bound by her own hands, but the words would not come. And so she simply sat there, her heart breaking for him, for the boy he had been and the man he had become. They rode the rest of the way in silence. When they reached the stables, a groom came to take their horses, and Claire lingered a moment to stroke the bay mare's neck, to let the warmth of the animal steady her trembling hands. It was then that she heard it, a soft whine, low and plaintive, coming from the corner stall. She turned. Bramble, Edward's lame hunting dog, was lying on a pile of straw, his head resting on his paws, his brown eyes watching her with the patient sadness of a creature who had learned to expect little from the world. Claire had grown fond of the dog over the past weeks, the way he limped along beside Edward on their evening walks, the way he never quite wagged his tail but thumped it. Once, when he was pleased, she went to him now. "Kneel and think in the straw," and he pushed his cold nose into her palm. His collar was worn leather, old and cracked, and as she stroked his neck, her fingers caught on something. A small brass plate, tarnished with age, fixed to the collar. She turned it toward the lantern light and read the name engraved there, worn smooth but still legible. Eleanor. Her breath stopped. The world seemed to tilt around her. The straw and the lantern and the dog's warm breath all falling away for a moment, replaced by the image of a boy by the river, and a girl whose name she had never known, and a lamb that had fallen through the ice. Edward had said his sister died trying to save a lamb. This dog had been hers. He had kept her dog all these years, had fed it and walked it and pretended it was just a stray he had taken in. And all the while the name on the collar had been speaking the truth he could not say aloud. Claire sat back on her heels, her hand still resting on Bramble's head. The dog leaned into her touch, and she felt the weight of the years in that small gesture. The love that Edward had carried for his sister, and the guilt he had wrapped around it like a cloak. She had to tell him. Not just about the river, not just about the boy with the wounded arm. She had to tell him that she understood, that she had seen his grief before she ever knew its name, that the promise her mother had made with a silver coin and an oak tree had led her to this moment, to this stable, to this dog with his sister's name around his neck. She rose to her feet and walked back toward the castle, Bramble leaping along beside her as if he had decided in that moment that she was worth following. The snow had begun to fall again, soft and quiet, and the lights in the castle windows glowed gold against the dark. Ard was standing in the doorway of the great hall when she reached the top of the steps. He had shed his cloak and stood in his tunic, his hair damp from the snow, and the sight of him there, weary and unguarded, made her chest ache with a tenderness she had not known she was capable of. "Bramble seems to have taken a liking to you," he said, and there was something almost shy in his voice, a crack in the armor she had not seen before. "He is a good dog," Claire said. "He knows who to trust." Edward looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, very quietly, "So do I." He turned and went inside, and Claire stood in the falling snow with her heart hammering against her ribs, the name on the brass plate burning in her memory, the truth pressing against her lips like a river that could not be held back much longer. She would tell him. Tomorrow, she would tell him everything. But tonight, she would let herself feel the weight of what she had learned, and she would let it change her. The way the boy by the river had changed her 11 years ago. The way this man with his grief and his dog and his unspoken kindness was changing her still. The snow fell, soft and relentless, and in the great hall the fire burned low, and somewhere in the castle a door closed with a sound like a held breath. The snow had stopped by morning, leaving the world hushed and white. Claire woke before dawn, as she always did now, and lay still in the gray light listening to the castle breathe around her. Today she would tell him, today the river of truth she had held back for 11 years would finally find its way to the sea. She dressed carefully, in the plain wool gown she wore when she walked the village, and she tucked the silver coin into the pocket sewn into her bodice. It had been her oldest, I had been hers for as long as she could remember, and tonight she would place it in Edward's hand and let it speak the words she had been too afraid to say. She found him in the great hall, standing before the fire with Bramble at his feet. He turned when she entered, and something in his face softened, the way it always did now when he saw her. "You're up early," he said. "I have something to tell you," Claire said. "Something I should have told you a long time ago." Edward studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded and gestured to the chair beside the fire. "Sit, tell me." She sat. She did not know where to begin, so she began where her memory began, at the river. 11 years ago, when she was a girl of 12 with skinned knees and a heart full of grief for a mother who had just died. "There was a boy," she said slowly, "at the south bend of the river where the water runs fast after the spring melt. He had fallen in, he couldn't swim. I pulled him out." Edward went very still. He was not looking at her anymore. He was looking at the fire, but she could see his hands, white-knuckled, gripping the arms of his chair. "I didn't know who he was," Claire said. "He was just a boy, shivering and scared. I gave him my cloak and told him he was safe. He told me his name, but I didn't understand what it meant. I was just a shepherd's daughter." I didn't know the names of lords. She reached into her bodice and drew out the silver coin. She held it out to him. He gave me this, she said. He said it was his mother's and that I should keep it so I would remember that I had saved a life. I've kept it every day since. Edward's hand trembled as he took the coin. He turned it over. On one side, the oak tree of House Thornwood. On the other, the initials R.T. Rosalind. Think. The Thornwood. His mother. His breath caught. He looked up at Claire and his eyes were bright with something she could not name. "It was you," he said. "The girl at the river. It was you." "Yes," she said. "It was me." He stared at her. "I looked for you," he said. "For years. I told myself I dreamed it, that I imagined the whole thing. But I never forgot. I never forgot the girl who pulled me from the water and told me I was safe." "I didn't know you were the Alpha King," Claire said. "Not until the betrothal. And by then, I didn't know how to tell you. I was afraid you would think I had married you for what you could give me, that I had used an old kindness to buy my way into the castle." Edward shook his head slowly. "I would never have thought that," he said. "You pulled me from that river when I was drowning. You could have asked for anything that day. You asked for nothing." He looked down at the coin in his palm, and his voice broke when he spoke again. "She gave that coin to a traveler once," he said. "My mother. Years ago, when the harvest failed and a woman came through the village with a small child begging for work. My mother gave her food and shelter, and when the woman left, she pressed this coin into her hand and said, 'If you ever need a place to stay, come to Thornwood and show them this.'" Claire felt the world tilt around her. "My mother," she whispered. "She never used it. She said it was her most precious thing and she kept it hidden, in case we ever needed a home." Edward's eyes met hers, and neither of them spoke for a long moment. The fire crackled. Bramble whined softly and pushed his wet nose into Edward's hand. "There's more," Claire said. "About your sister." Edward flinched, but he did not look away. "The day Eleanor died," Claire said, "I will thank the river the South Bend. I had gone back to look for you, for the boy I'd saved, to see if he was all right. I saw a little girl on the ice, reaching for a lamb that had fallen through. I tried to call out, but I was too far away. By the time I reached the bank, she was gone. I never knew her name. I never knew she was your sister." Edward was very pale now. He sat motionless, the coin clutched in his hand, and she could see the grief rising in him like a tide. "She didn't fall in because I was careless," he said hoarsely. "I was supposed to be watching her. I was supposed to keep her safe." "No," Claire said, "you weren't there. You couldn't have been. She went out alone in the snow to save that lamb. No one was watching her. No one could have stopped her. She was brave, and she was quick, and the ice broke before anyone could reach her." Edward's hand tightened around the coin. A tear slipped down his cheek and he did not wipe it away. "I've carried that guilt for 20 years, he said. "Every night I see her face. Every night I wonder what I could have done differently." "You did nothing wrong," Claire said. She reached across the space between them and took his hand, the hand that held the coin, the hand that wore his mother's gift. "You were a boy. She was a girl who loved a lamb more than she feared the ice. And I was a girl who was too far away to save her. We were all just children, Edward. We were all just children who could not hold back the river." He looked at her then, and she saw something break open in his face, the wall he had built around his grief cracking at last. He did not speak. He simply held her hand and let the tears come, and she stayed with him as the fire burned low and the snow began to fall again outside the window. Sir Aldrich failed them there. An hour later, Claire and Edward sitting side by side on the hearth, Bramble asleep at their feet. He had come to report on the grain stores, but he stopped in the doorway when he saw them. He looked at Claire, at the way she held the king's hand, at the way she had stayed with him through his grief, at the way she had walked through the famine-stricken villages and given her own portion of bread to a child who had none. He bowed his head. "My lady," he said, "I owe you an apology." Claire looked up, surprised. "Sir Aldrich, I thought you came to take from him," the old knight said. "I thought you were like the others, the ones who married for power, for gold, for a title. I was wrong." He met her eyes, and for the first time, There was no steel in his gaze. "You gave him back something I have not seen in 20 years. You gave him peace." Edward cleared his throat. "Aldrich, you old fool," he said, but his voice was gentle. "You've been carrying that rock in your pocket for a week. Go on then, say your piece properly." Aldrich reached into his pocket and pulled out a smooth, gray stone, worn round by years of river water. He held it out to Claire. "I find these when I'm thinking," he said gruffly. "This one, I found it the day you arrived. I was thinking you'd be trouble. Turns out I was wrong about that too." He pressed the stone into her hand. "It's just a stone, but it's a good one." Claire closed her fingers around it, warm from his pocket, and she felt something loosen in her chest. "Thank you, Sir Aldrich," she said. "I'll keep it." Aldrich nodded once, gruffly, and turned to go. At the door he paused. "The grain will last the winter," he said. "We'll make it through." When he was gone, Edward turned to Claire. His eyes were still red, but there was something new in them. Something light, as if a weight he had carried for 20 years had finally been set down. "You came back to the river," he said. "You came back to look for me." "I did," she said. "I wanted to make sure you were all right." "And I wasn't there," he said. "I never came back to thank you. I never came back at all." "You were a boy who had just nearly drowned," Claire said. "You had no obligation to come back." "But I should have," he said. "I should have found you. I spent 20 years looking for you in every face I met, and I didn't recognize you until you were already mine." He lifted the silver coin, and he held it out to her. "This is yours," he said. "It was always yours. You earned it twice. Once when you saved my life, and again when you saved my soul." Claire shook her head. "It's your mother's," she said. "It belongs to House Thornwood. It belongs to you," he said. "And so do I." The words hung in the air between them, simple and enormous, and Claire felt her heart crack open like ice in the spring melt. "I have loved you since the river," he said quietly. "I didn't know it then. I thought I was remembering a kindness, but it was you. It was always you. And when I married you, I thought I was settling for a stranger. Instead, I married the only girl who ever saw me clearly." Claire's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't tell you," she said. "I should have told you sooner. I was so afraid." "I know," he said. "I know." He reached up and pumped her face in his hand, his thumb brushing the tear from her cheek. "But you told me now, and that is enough. That is more than enough." The fire crackled. The snow fell. Bramble slept on, dreaming of lambs. And in the great hall of Thornwood Castle, two people who had been searching for each other for finally stopped searching. "Tomorrow," Edward said softly, "I want to go to the river, the South Bend. I want to see it again, with you. I want to see the place where you saved me, and I want to say goodbye to Eleanor there, properly." Claire nodded. "I'll go with you," she said. "I'll be right there with you." He smiled, a real smile, the kind she had never seen on his face before, open and unguarded and full of light. "I know you will," he said. "You always have been." And in the falling snow, by the low burning fire, with a dog at their feet and a silver coin between their palms, the Alpha King of Thornwood and the shepherd's daughter who had saved his life held each other, and let the river of grief finally carry them home. The snow melted overnight, as if the land itself had been waiting for permission to change. By the time the first pale light touched the eastern tower, the paths were running with clear water, and the air smelled of wet earth and the first brave tips of green. Claire stood at the window of her chamber, watching the frost slip from the glass in long, silent streaks. Somewhere below, she could hear the kitchen doors banging open, old Nan's voice rising over the clatter of pots, scolding the scullery boys for burning the porridge. It was an ordinary sound, and it made her smile. She had not slept much, but it was not the restless sleeplessness of the early weeks. It was the quiet alertness of a person who knows that today matters, and who has decided to be fully awake for it. Marin came in without knocking, as she always did, a thick woolen cloak folded over her arm. "Mistress, you'll catch a chill by that window. The floor's like ice." "I know," Claire said, turning. "I'll be warm enough. We're going to the river." Marin's hand stilled on you cloak. She had been with Claire long enough to know what that meant, and she did not ask. She only crossed the room, set the cloak around Claire's shoulders, and fastened it with the old silver pin that had been a wedding gift from a woman neither of them would ever meet. "Then you'd best take this," Marin said quietly. pressing something small and warm into Claire's palm. It was a sprig of dried rosemary tied with a bit of red wool. "For remembrance," Marin said, "for the ones we carry with us." Claire closed her fingers around it. "Thank you, Marin." "Go on then," Marin said, her voice brisk to hide the softness. "He's waiting in the yard, and he's got that dog with him, the one that limps. You'd think he was taking the creature to a coronation the way he's fussing over it." Claire laughed, a small surprised sound. "That's Bramble. He fusses because he loves him? He fusses because he's a great king who pretends he has no heart, and that dog knows it," Marin said. And for once, Claire did not correct her. The yard was brighter than she expected. The snow had retreated into the shadows under the walls, and the cobblestones gleamed with melted water. Edward stood by the gate, holding the reins of a quiet gray mare, and beside him, sitting with patient dignity in the mud, was Bramble. The dog's tail thumped when he saw her. Edward turned. He looked different this morning. Not the cold, guarded king of the wedding feast, and not the grieving man of the night before. There was a stillness in him, a settled calm like a river that had finally found its level after a long storm. "You came," he said, and his voice was soft with wonder, as if he had not quite believed she would. "I said I would," Claire said simply. "I'm right here." He helped her onto the mare and things set out through the postern gate, past the last of the winter gardens, down the long slope toward the river. Bramble trotted ahead, his limp barely noticeable now, his nose low to the ground. The path was muddy and the air was cold, but the sun was climbing, and the light had a new quality to it, thinner, brighter, more patient. They rode in silence. For a long while it was not the heavy silence of strangers, nor the careful silence of people who do not trust one another yet. It was the companionable silence of two people who have already said the important things and are content to let the small things wait. When they reached the south bend, Edward reined in his horse and dismounted. Claire followed. The river was high with melted snow, running fast and clear over the stones. The willow tree that leaned over the bend was still bare, but its branches were swollen with buds, and the reeds along the bank had begun to show the first pale green of new growth. Edward stood at the water's edge, looking at the place where the current curled and deepened. His hands were at his sides and his shoulders were straight, but Claire could see the tension in his jaw. "This is where it happened," he said quietly. "She was trying to save a lamb. It had wandered onto the ice and it slipped through. She went in after it. She was a good swimmer, better than me, but the current was too strong that day and the water was so cold." Claire did not speak. She stood beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, and she waited. "I always thought I should have been there," Edward said. "I was supposed to be watching her that afternoon, but I'd gone off to the forge to watch the smith. I was angry at her for something stupid, a game we'd been playing, I don't even remember what. And when I came back, she was gone." His voice cracked, just slightly, on the last word. "I carried that for 20 years, he said. "I told myself it was my fault. If I'd been there, I could have stopped her. I could have pulled her out. I could have—" He stopped. The river ran on, indifferent and patient. "Edward," Claire said softly, "you were a boy. You were a child, and you made a child's choice. And even if you had been there, you could not have stopped that current. No one could have." He turned to look at her, and his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I know that now. Because of you. Because you showed me that I've been carrying something I never needed to carry." He reached into his tunic and drew out a folded letter, yellowed with age, tied with a faded blue ribbon. It was one of the letters they had found in the old study, the ones Eleanor had written to him never sent, full of a child's bright, ordinary news. "I want to leave this here," he said. "I want to give it back to the river. I want to tell her I'm sorry I never read it, and I want to tell her I'm all right now." Claire nodded. "That's a good thing to do." He knelt by the water's edge, and for a long moment he simply held the letter in both hands, his head bowed. Then he pressed it to his lips, and he laid it gently on the current. The paper floated for a breath, 2 breaths, turning slowly in the clear water. Then the current caught it, and it slid away downstream, past the willow, around the bend, until it was gone. Edward stayed on his knees for a while, his hands resting on the wet stones. Bramble patted over and pressed his damp nose against Edward's shoulder, and Edward reached up, almost without thinking, to rest his hand on the dog's head. "She saved him too," Edward said quietly. "Bramble, she found him on the road, half drowned, with a broken leg. She carried him all the way home in her arms and begged me to let her keep him. I said no. I said he was too much trouble. He laughed, a soft, rueful sound. She kept him anyway, hid him in the stable for a week until Mother found out. And Mother, who never raised her voice to anyone, looked at me and said, "Edward, the child has a kind heart. Do not teach her to be ashamed of it." Claire knelt beside him, careless of the mud soaking into her skirts. She took his hand, the one resting on Bramble's head, and held it. "She must have been wonderful," Claire said. "She was," Edward said. "She was the best of us, and I spent 20 years thinking I had failed her." "You didn't fail her," Claire said. "You loved her. You've loved her every day since. That's not failure, Edward. That's the opposite of failure." He turned to look at her, and in his eyes she saw something she had not seen before. Not grief, not guilt, but a quiet, wondering peace, like a man who has finally set down a burden he had forgotten he was carrying. "How do you know these things?" he asked. "How do you always know the right thing to say?" Claire smiled, and the smile was a little sad. "Because someone taught me," she said. "My mother. She was the one who taught me that kindness is not weakness, and that the people who seem strongest are often the ones who need it most." Edward was quiet for a moment. "Your mother?" he said. "The one with the silver coin? The one who left Thornwood?" "Yes," Claire said. And then, because the morning felt like a time for truths, she told him the rest. "My mother was a lady's maid at a great house in the East," she said. "She was young, and she fell in love with a man who was not free to love her back. When sure of men, thankfully she was with child. He gave her money and told her to leave. She never told him about me. She never told anyone his name." She paused, and Edward did not press her. He only waited, his hand warm around hers. "She walked for weeks," Claire said. "She had nothing but the clothes she wore, and a small bundle of belongings. And one night, in a storm, she came to a castle gate and begged for shelter. The lady of the castle took her in, fed her, gave her a bed by the fire, and when my mother left the next morning, the lady pressed a silver coin into her hand and said, 'If you ever need a home, come back. Show this coin at the gate, and you will be let in.'" She reached into the collar of her dress and drew out the coin, worn and warm from her skin. The oak tree on its face caught the morning light. "That lady," Claire said, looking up at Edward, "was your mother, Rosalind." Edward stared at the coin. His hand trembled just slightly around hers. "My mother never used it," Claire said. "She was too proud, I think, or too afraid that she would be turned away. She raised me in a village far from here, and she worked her whole life so that I would never have to beg for anything. She died when I was 16, and she gave me this coin on her deathbed. She told me, 'Someday, if you are ever truly lost, take this to the castle on the hill. The lady there will help you.'" Edward's voice was barely a whisper. "She never came back." "No," Claire said, "she never did. But she kept the coin, Edward. She kept it her whole life. She told me it was the only kindness she had ever been shown without wanting something in return. And she taught me that kindness was worth more than gold." Edward looked at her, and there was something raw and open in his face, something he had never shown anyone. "Your mother," he said slowly, "was the woman my mother spoke of, the one she always hoped would come back. She used to look out the window at the road and say, 'There's a woman out there who carries a piece of this house in her pocket. Someday she'll come home.'" Claire's eyes filled with tears. "She did come home," she said, "in a way. She came back the night she died, when she told me about the coin, and I came back for her. I came back to the castle on the hill, and I found a home there." Edward reached up very gently and wiped the tears from her cheek with his thumb. "You found more than a home," he said. "You found the man who owes you his life. Twice over." "Once," Claire said, smiling through her tears. "I only pulled you out of the river once." "Then let me spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to do it again," Edward said. "And let me be worthy of the kindness your mother taught you to carry." They stayed by the river until the sun climbed high and the shadows shortened. Edward took the silver coin from Claire's palm, held it up to the light, and pressed it gently to his lips. "This is ours now," he said, "and I'm going to put it somewhere safe, where it can remind us of who we are and where we came from." He tucked it carefully into the inner pocket of his tunic, close to his heart. They mounted the horses and rode back toward the castle, and the path that had seemed so long and cold on the way down felt shorter and warmer on the way back. Bramble trotted between them, his tail high, and the first birds of spring sang from the hedgerows. When they reached the gate, old Nan was waiting with a fresh apple pie, still warm from the oven, and Sir Aldrich was standing in the yard with a small, rough stone in his hand. "Found this, by the raw. Thiver. Years ago," he said gruffly, holding it out to Claire. "Always thought it was just a rock, but it's got a shape to it, like a heart. Thought you might want it, my lady, to remind you of the day the king learned to smile." Claire took the stone. It was smooth and gray and warm in her hand, and yes, it was shaped like a heart. "Thank you, Sir Aldrich," she said. The old knight cleared his throat and looked away. "Right, well, there's porridge burning, and that's a cry worse than treason." He stomped off toward the kitchens, and Marin appeared in the doorway, her half-finished scarf trailing behind her. "Mistress, you're soaked to the bone. Come in and get warm." But Claire lingered a moment in the yard, looking up at the castle walls, at the gray stone that had stood for generations, at the banners stirring in the spring wind. "Are you coming?" Edward asked, pausing at the door. She turned to him and she smiled, a real smile, open and full of light, the kind that reaches the eyes. "I'm coming," she said. "I'm home." He held out his hand, and she took it, and they walked into the castle together. Behind them, the snow had all but vanished, and the first green shoots were pushing up through the thawing earth. And in the great hall of Thornwood Castle, by the fire that never went out, the Alpha King and the shepherd's daughter who had saved his life sat down to warm their hands and eat old Nan's apple pie, with a heart-shaped stone on the table between them and a silver coin resting close to the king's heart. Winter had ended. Spring had come. And for two people who had spent their whole lives searching for each other, the best part of the story was just beginning. Sometimes the highest walls are built by those who need love the most. Claire's quiet patience didn't just save a drowning boy. It melted the frozen heart of an Alpha King. If Edward and Claire's journey of healing touched your soul, please hit that like button and subscribe for more heartwarming romances. Have you ever waited for someone to finally see the real you? Tell us your story in the comments below.